Your ideas are just too nostalgic for the vision we're going after. That's what Naomi said to me as she closed her office door behind her. She'd only been the new owner of Ember Row for 2 weeks, barely long enough to find the espresso machine. And already she had opinions about everything, especially the food. I'm Marco Santini, 41, executive chef at what used to be Sable and Hearth, a cozy, fire-lit restaurant in Asheville, North Carolina. For 8 years, I'd poured my soul into that kitchen, crafted dishes with warmth and history, dishes that meant something. I didn't follow trends or chase stars. I made food that made people remember. Naomi didn't look up from her tablet. We're going for more edge, more visual drama. Think global street food meets fine dining, something TikTok will love. I stayed quiet, let her talk. When she finally stopped, I nodded once. So, when's my last day? She blinked, surprised, as if she expected me to argue or negotiate for a second chance. But I don't beg people to see what they were never meant to understand. 8 years of refining the recipes my aunt taught me back in Palermo. 8 years of building a menu that made people close their eyes when the flavors hit. And now, replaced by flash and foam. Naomi smiled, relieved. 2 weeks should be enough to wrap up. Please prepare a full documentation of all signature recipes. I nodded again. We both knew those recipes weren't written anywhere. Not the real ones. Later that night, I stayed long after service ended, alone at the bar with a glass of Amaro. I ran my fingers over the weathered oak, thinking of all the guests who sat there, who'd shared anniversaries, quiet wins, losses, first dates. That bar had held their stories, and mine. If you've ever loved something you built with your hands, only to watch someone else erase it, hit like, subscribe, and share, because this is only the beginning. The next morning, I arrived before anyone else. The air in the kitchen was still, like it hadn't realized yet that something had changed. I moved quietly, almost reverently, placing my personal knives into their worn leather roll. Each one sharpened to perfection, each one familiar as my own hands. I was halfway through when Matteo walked in, my sous chef for the last 6 years. He stopped short when he saw what I was doing. "Marco?" he asked, voice low. "What's going on?" I didn't look up, just zipped the roll and set it aside. "Naomi's making changes," I said. "She wants something different. My last day is in 2 weeks." Matteo's jaw tensed. "This place is packed every night. People come here for your food, for your story." I gave a small shrug. Not anymore. He didn't argue, but I could feel the heat radiating off him. He watched me for a moment longer, then turned away, heading toward the prep station like muscle memory had kicked in. But his movements were sharper, more brittle than usual. That evening, I didn't tell the rest of the staff. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched from the pass as service unfolded. The rhythm of the kitchen still pulsed. Matteo working the grill with the instinct of a veteran. Lila plating with the focus of a surgeon. No one knew this was the beginning of the end. Every ticket we sent out carried weight I couldn't explain. Each dish felt like a secret I was whispering one last time. After closing, I stayed behind again, wiping down the counters alone. I poured myself a second glass of Amaro and sat under the dim pendant light at the corner of the bar, the same place where I used to wait for deliveries in the early days. The silence was thick, but not empty. It was full of memories, of laughter echoing through the kitchen, of quiet nods between chefs mid-rush, of 1,000 small victories no one ever saw. And yet, for the first time in 8 years, I couldn't feel the room breathing with me. Something essential had already slipped away. When I was 8, I stood on a wooden crate in my aunt's kitchen in Palermo, barely tall enough to see over the counter. Flour dusted my sleeves. My hands trembled as I shaped pasta under her watchful gaze. She didn't believe in measuring cups. Only instinct, smell, feel. Food remembers, she used to say, tapping her chest. Even if people forget. Those words lived in me, quietly, long after I left Sicily. I didn't move to Asheville to become a chef. I was supposed to be an architect, sketching towers, not seasoning stews. I got into UNC Asheville on a partial scholarship and washed dishes at a small bistro called Bellamy's to make rent. It was supposed to be temporary. Until one night, the line cook quit mid-shift. The owner turned to me in desperation. "You know anything about pasta?" I nodded, lied, slipped on an apron, and never looked back. Something clicked that night. The rhythm, the fire, the quiet urgency of the kitchen. It made more sense to me than any blueprint ever had. 6 months later, I dropped out of school. My father didn't speak to me for nearly a year. But I kept going, station to station, kitchen to kitchen. I learned from anyone who'd teach me. Took double shifts, burned my hands, ruined shoes, missed birthdays, all for the chance to cook something honest. When I walked into Sable and Hearth for the first time, the place was half empty. Faded walls, a tired menu. The owner, Gene, was ready to close shop. "I'm out of ideas," he said. "You've got one shot. Cook what matters to you." So I did. I brought in the slow-braised beef my aunt made every Easter, the orange-zested polenta cake we served at family weddings, the lemon broth my uncle insisted could cure anything. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. And that was enough. At least, it used to be. When Gene's wife got sick, he sold the restaurant to a hospitality group out of Charlotte. For the first few months, they mostly left me alone. Their regional director stopped by once, glanced at the numbers, and said, "Don't fix what isn't broken." I agreed. For 3 years, I ran Sable and Hearth like it was still mine. Same open kitchen, same handwritten specials. We built a quiet reputation, steady reviews, word of mouth, travelers who changed their itineraries just to stop by. Then they sold it to Naomi. She arrived with a clipboard and a marketing team. Started showing up during prep, asking questions that made it obvious she didn't understand restaurants. "Why do you use this cut of meat instead of something more elegant? Could we make the risotto blue for the visual impact?" I bit my tongue so often those weeks I nearly bled. She brought influencers in during dinner rush. Had them take photos mid-service, leaning over dishes, blocking runners. She once sent back our roast duck because it didn't pop on camera. 2 weeks before she called me into her office, I overheard her on the phone. "We'll keep the name for now. But the vibe? Totally different. Elevated street food, tasting menu options, a new chef with a bold look, something press-worthy." I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. But some part of me, naive maybe, believed she'd leave the soul of the place alone. I spent so long pouring myself into that menu, I didn't think anyone would be foolish enough to tear it apart just to chase hashtags and headlines. But Naomi wasn't building a restaurant. She was building a brand, and I was just another part of the inventory. I didn't say anything when I heard those words on the phone. I just kept stirring the sauce that night, slow and steady. But in my gut, something shifted. The storm had already started. 3 days after I packed my knives, I turned off my phone. I didn't want updates. Didn't want to hear how the new chef, some guy named Bryce from a globally inspired tapas bar in Atlanta, was already changing the line layout and replacing the house bread with dehydrated squid crackers. But Mateo showed up anyway. He knocked once, then let himself in like he always had, still in his apron, eyes wide with frustration. "It's chaos," he said, dropping onto my couch. "Bryce doesn't know what he's doing. He keeps asking where the real recipes are." I didn't flinch. "They have the official ones." Mateo shook his head. "Yeah, the versions you wrote up for the health inspector. He's trying, but it's all wrong. The broth is flat, the lamb's dry. He tried making the polenta cake and set off the fire alarm." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. It's not my kitchen anymore. Mateo looked at me like I'd said something in another language. "Marco, the guests know. Mrs. Landry sent back her duck. Said it tasted like someone else's memory." That one stung. She'd come in every Thursday for 5 years. Knew all our names. Always asked if I still use lemon zest from local groves. "They're doing a big relaunch next week," he said. "Food critics, local press, influencers. Naomi's calling it Ember Row Reimagined." I didn't reply. But something flickered inside me. Not pride, not even satisfaction. Recognition. I hadn't fully formed the thought, but I could feel it stirring in the silence that followed. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the start of something that was finally, completely mine. That night, after Mateo left, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table long past midnight, a blank notepad in front of me and 1,000 half-formed thoughts circling like smoke. Opening my own restaurant. Was that really what I wanted? Or was it just defiance in disguise? I thought about the empty building my grandfather had left behind. His old trattoria downtown, shuttered since I was a teenager. I still held the deed. The windows were dusted over, the paint peeled, but the bones were good, solid, familiar. The next morning, I called my cousin Leo, a business attorney in Raleigh. I asked him to look over my old employment contract, just in case. An hour later, he called back. "You've got a problem," he said. "There's a non-compete clause." I felt my stomach tighten. "It says you can't open a similar food concept within 5 miles of Ember Row for 2 years. Leo explained. "That includes any menu or experience that could be considered competitive." 5 miles. My grandfather's trattoria was just under 4. I exhaled slowly. "Is it airtight?" "Not necessarily," he said. "There's wiggle room if your new concept is substantially different. You'd have to prove that it's not a modern bistro, not new American. Something distinct, a different experience entirely." I stared out the window at the quiet street below. My mind drifted back to those long summer nights in Sicily. String lights over chipped tables, checkered cloths, the smell of basil and garlic and wood smoke. What if I went full traditional? I asked. Old world Italian, family-style dishes, my grandfather's exact recipes. No tweaks, no foams, no fusion. Leo paused, then nodded on the other end. That could work. Different audience, different price point, different culinary identity, risky but possible. I hung up and looked around my small apartment. For the first time in days, my chest felt lighter. I wasn't chasing what I lost, I was building what I was meant to return to all along. 2 days later, I stood inside the old trattoria. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the walls were sun-faded, and the air smelled like dust and memory. My grandfather's copper pot still hung above the doorway, tarnished but proud. I ran my hand along the edge of the old counter where he used to pour glasses of Chianti and argue about soccer with his friends. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, Mateo, Lila, and Jason came over after their shift at Ember Row. They looked tired, not just physically, but soul tired. Jason dropped into the armchair with a heavy sigh. They're serving scallop foam on puffed rice. Bryce calls it a coastal reinterpretation. It tastes like nothing. Lila nodded. They changed the plating station 3 times in one night. It's all smoke and no soul. I poured them wine and listened. Then I said it, quietly but clearly. I'm reopening the trattoria. Mateo looked up. For real? For real, I said. Traditional menu, family recipes, no filters, no spectacle, just food that means something. But I won't do it alone. Lila didn't even hesitate. I'm in. Jason raised his glass. Tell me when and where. Mateo leaned forward. I've got a weekend free. We could start cleaning, painting. I still remember your aunt's lemon risotto. If you're bringing that back, I'm not missing it. We talked late into the night about layout, storage, sourcing ingredients, music playlists, and the smell of garlic hitting olive oil. It wasn't a strategy meeting. It was a reunion. I went to bed that night with sore hands and a tired heart. But for the first time in weeks, I dreamed of the kitchen again. Not the one I'd lost, the one I was about to build. The week before Ember Row's relaunch, the food blogs lit up. Photos started circulating, deconstructed versions of my dishes, but barely recognizable. Foam where there should have been a slow reduction. Garnishes that looked like plastic confetti, tiny portions balanced on slabs of slate. The comments hit fast. This isn't what made that place special. What happened to the braised beef? Why does everything look like a science project? I didn't reply. I just kept sanding the old butcher block counter at the trattoria, sweat on my forehead, paint under my nails, garlic bulbs drying in a crate nearby. Then Naomi called. First time I'd heard her voice since she let me go. Marco, she said, overly warm. How are you? Busy. We're having some transition challenges. I was hoping you might consider consulting, just short term, a few weeks, help smooth things out. I set down the rag. You have the recipes. There are nuances missing, she said carefully. Kevin's talented. Dishes aren't landing right. I almost laughed. Nuances like adjusting salt when the humidity shifts, or the fact that Gulf shrimp need more acid than Atlantic, or that the cake needs 5 extra minutes if you're baking after rain. She hesitated. We'd compensate you well. Triple your old salary. Credit you as founding chef. It's not about money. Then what? She snapped. Pride? No, I said. It's about knowing when something is no longer yours and building what is. I hung up. An hour later, Mateo texted. She's in the kitchen, watching every step, taking notes like she's trying to reverse engineer you. 2 days before the relaunch, I bumped into Jean, the original owner, at the farmer's market. Naomi called me, he said. Wanted to know if I had any of your old prep logs. I told her your food was always magic, but magic doesn't write itself down. That afternoon, Lila texted too. 5th attempt at your polenta cake. Still wrong. I smiled for the first time all day. Let them try. They were chasing a shadow, and I was already stepping into the light. The night before Ember Row's relaunch, I was scrubbing the baseboards at the trattoria when someone knocked on my apartment door. Naomi. I opened it without a word. She stepped in like she belonged there, heels clicking, perfume heavy, a folder clutched in one hand. One last offer, she said, skipping pleasantries. Come back. Full creative control. 20% ownership. I leaned against the counter. Why? She didn't flinch. Because tonight's practice run was a disaster. The risotto split. The lamb was bland. The critics are coming, and our reservations for the next month are riding on your name. I said nothing, just waited. I made a mistake, she added, softer now. I thought I could reimagine something before I understood what made it work. For a moment, I considered it. 20% was no small stake. But then I thought of the trattoria, of Matteo sanding the old shelves, of Lila testing the cannoli filling, of Jason setting the tables by hand, one wine glass at a time. I've started something new, I said. Something real. I won't trade it to patch a broken version of what used to be. Her tone shifted, cold, clipped. You're opening within 4 miles of Ember Row. You know your contract has a non-compete clause. I stiffened. You can't legally operate a similar restaurant concept within 5 miles. For 2 years, I could shut you down before you serve your first plate. I hadn't remembered the clause. Hadn't thought to check. Good to know, I said quietly, stepping aside and holding the door open. She paused, scanning my face for weakness. Then she walked out. The moment the door clicked shut, I called Leo. Told him everything. He promised to review the clause in detail the next morning. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. A storm was coming. But this time, I wasn't going to weather it in silence. I was going to meet it head on, with flour-dusted hands and a kitchen that felt like home. The next morning, relaunch day. I sat across from Leo in his office, fingers tapping against a chipped ceramic mug. He scanned the contract slowly, every line, every clause, brows drawn together like a storm cloud. There might be a way out, he finally said. The non-compete specifically states that you can't open a similar restaurant concept within 5 miles. But that wording is vague. Define similar, I asked. He leaned back. Ember Row is classified as modern American fusion. Upscale, trend-driven. What you're planning, if you stick to traditional Sicilian, family-style service, rustic decor, handwritten menus, it could be argued it's a completely different experience. I sat with that for a long beat. The truth was, I'd been building something halfway between past and present. Still using some of my reinterpretations, still holding on to touches from Sable and Hearth. Maybe I'd been afraid that going fully old world meant losing something. But maybe that was the point, I nodded. Then I'll go all the way back. No fusion, no edits. Just Nano's food, exactly how he made it. Leo smiled. It's risky, but I can defend it. And honestly, after everything Naomi's changed at Ember Row, even she's made the argument for us. It's not the same restaurant you left. When I got home, I texted Matteo, we're going traditional. Like red checkered tablecloth traditional. He replied within seconds. Hell yes. Later that day, Jason sent me a message from the relaunch. Critics are here. Lamb's overcooked. Bryce looks like he might cry. I didn't respond. That evening, the whole team gathered in the trattoria. No plaster dust this time, no floor plans. Just Lila testing tiramisu ratios, while Matteo and I debated sauce consistency like it was life or death. We weren't building a comeback. We were restoring something sacred, something that had been waiting quietly in the bones of that old building through every storm. And now finally, it was ready to breathe again. The reviews dropped the next morning. Style over substance. A hollow echo of what once was. The heart of Sable and Hearth didn't disappear. It just moved across town. I read those lines while sitting on the floor of the trattoria, surrounded by crates of tomatoes and bundled herbs. Leela stood across from me, mouth half open in disbelief. Matteo just shook his head and grinned. That afternoon, I signed the lease for a small cafe space directly across from the trattoria. 12 tables, a narrow prep kitchen, windows that caught the afternoon sun just right. It wasn't part of the original plan, but word was already spreading that I was cooking again, and we needed a soft opening while the main space finished renovations. We named it Santini's Table. No grand launch, no ribbon cutting, just an Instagram post from Lila and a handwritten sign taped to the door. Opening soon. Traditional Sicilian. On our first night, we served 40 covers with just the 4 of us. Matteo and I handled the kitchen. Jason and Lila worked the floor like it was a dance they'd always known. We served Nonno's meatballs, lemon rosemary chicken, and a polenta cake that made a grown man cry quietly into his espresso. 2 weeks in, we were fully booked every night. Then, one Thursday, I looked up from the pass and saw Mrs. Landry standing in the doorway, clutching her coat. Her eyes were glassy. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said softly. "Nothing's tasted right since you left." I walked her to her table myself. That night, I added the duck back to the menu, just for her. A few days later, my father called. We hadn't spoken much since I left architecture school. "Your mother told me," he said. "You're using your grandfather's recipes?" "All of them." There was a long pause, then, "He'd be proud." And for the first time in years, I believed that was true. It came on a Wednesday morning, tucked between a produce invoice and a wine delivery confirmation. The review, not from a blogger or food Instagrammer, but from Vincent Harlow, the senior critic at Asheville Weekly, known for being brutal, eloquent, and widely read. I unfolded the paper and stared at the column. My name wasn't mentioned directly, but the message was clear. Though Santini's Table offers sincerity and rustic charm, the execution falters. The eggplant in Voltini lacked cohesion, the pasta was slightly overdone, and the pacing between courses dragged. One hopes the heart guiding the kitchen will catch up to its ambition. I sat in silence for a long time. My hands rested on the stainless steel counter. The early prep sounds faded behind the ringing in my ears. Matteo came in, saw my face, and reached for the paper without asking. He read it quietly, then looked up. "He doesn't get it." I nodded, but something inside me twisted. Not because it hurt my pride, but because I knew some of it was true. That night, I couldn't focus during service. Every plated dish made me second-guess myself. I checked sauces twice, stood longer at the pass. My team noticed, but no one said a word. After closing, I pulled out the review again, rereading each line until the words blurred. Then I made a decision. The next afternoon, I walked into Vincent Harlow's office with a warm basket of lemon biscotti and a small tin of our house-made fig jam. He looked up, startled. "Chef Santini." "I read your review," I said calmly. "And you were right. Some dishes weren't ready. But I don't hide from criticism. I learned from it. So, come back. Let me show you what we've adjusted." He blinked, caught off guard, then nodded slowly. Most chefs send angry emails. "You bring jam." "I bring truth," I said. "And dessert helps." That night, back in the kitchen, something shifted. Not in the food, but in me. This wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when it stung, especially when it stung.